Worker co-ops, worker co-op businesses. Worker co-op sector. That's a worker co-op. A democratic enterprise? Democratize the enterprise. A worker co-op sector of the economy? Communism.
Hello! Exciting announcement time. Second thought, Yugopnik and I have decided to start the Deprogram together. It's a podcast in which we'll chill, meme, discuss capitalism, and generally just have a great time. History, current events, and a lot of shit talking. Loads of fun stuff planned for it, so please do check it out. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. Anyways, since my video critiquing UBI was well received, I thought I might make another similar video criticizing the idea of cooperatives. Before I get started though, it's not that I'm not in favor of cooperatives, I'm just gonna try to get across some food for thought about the implementation of cooperatives in a capitalist society versus a socialist one. TLDR, cooperatives are a great idea, I'm just unsure that they alone will bring down capitalism or launch us into socialism. With that said, let's get started. Now, co-ops, or cooperative enterprises, are simply enterprises in which the workers collectively own and govern the workings of their respective factory or workplace or whatever. There are many other formulations, but this is the important one for us. Basically, rather than have a small board of directors at the top deciding everything, the workers democratically decide on everything. They democratically decide what to produce, where to produce, when to produce, how much to produce, and what to do with the profits. We can pay ourselves more, have more leave of all forms, paid healthcare in countries where healthcare isn't public, etc., etc. Do note that this is the idea on paper. A lot of IRL cooperatives have differing degrees of worker input, ranging from quite a bit to nearly nothing at all. But issues arise that we need to discuss. Yes, some of these issues are common between conventionally organized small businesses and cooperatives, but we're talking about co-ops here, so let's just focus on that for now. Co-ops under capitalism, despite having some revolutionary potential, are nonetheless still working within the capitalist framework. This means two things. Firstly, the legal, political, and economic barriers should be noted. If cooperative movements grow, powerful enough to influence politics and agitate for their own interests, the ruling class will feel their profits threatened and will use the capitalist state to crush alternative forms of economic organization, just as they've always done. That's not even mentioning the economic and legal difficulties in starting a cooperative. Secondly, as competition is inherent to capitalism, and as a result of this competition, the cooperative and its process of production is made subject to the interests of capital, and by extension, exploitation. What this means is that exploitation becomes a necessary condition for the life and survival of the cooperative. Maybe not all the time, and maybe not as severe as within conventional capitalist enterprises, but it still generally happens. Now, how do capital motives lord over the cooperative exactly? 1. Through the intensification of labor. According to the situation in the market, workdays are either prolonged or shortened. Workers are hired and fired. The cooperative must compete with other, usually conventional capitalist enterprises to stay afloat, obviously. They must be competitive and efficient enough to at least remain with a meaningful market share, if not outright outcompete its competitors. Otherwise, they risk losing out on the market and failing. Hence, cooperative enterprises must employ all methods a conventional capitalist enterprise employs in order to stay competitive. And as a result of this, workers are forced into confused interests. As a worker, you want more off time, you want a higher wage, you want paid leave. But all this digs into the profits of the enterprise. Profits that must go into the circuit of capital to grow the business and continue being competitive in the market. If it can't manage to do that, a conventional capitalist enterprise will come along with horrible labor conditions and heavy extraction of surplus value, which ends up being more profitable and directly damaging the cooperative enterprise, either by providing products cheaper or by growing quicker on account of larger profits. As a result, workers must take the role of the capitalists themselves, and either turn the cooperative into a conventional capitalist enterprise, or, if the interests of the workers continue to predominate, the enterprise can risk failing. The former is something many IRL cooperatives end up resorting to, either by having a tiered system of workers employed by the co-op versus owner workers with a stake in the co-op, Mondragon is an example of this, or by basically resorting to more conventional organizational templates. Some cooperatives elect to lower wages, reduce benefits, etc. in order to keep the business afloat, which is a third option that should be mentioned. There is an argument that conventional capitalist enterprises waste money by funneling it into bloated salaries and bonuses for managers and board members, and this is an expense that cooperatives do not usually have, but I personally haven't seen any research that delves too deeply into this particular point. Still, I'd like to present both sides. There is a counter-argument to the basic premise, though. That premise being that conventional capitalist enterprises would beat out any cooperative, all things being equal. But conventional enterprises are not necessarily better at surviving in a capitalist market than cooperatives. Cooperatives can be considered to be more flexible, with some, like Bajo and Roland, showing cooperatives to have a lower failure rate than conventional enterprises. This can be explained by the fact that there is an incentive amongst cooperative workers that isn't present in workers working within a conventional enterprise. Those workers have no incentive to work harder than necessary to keep their positions, because they would never see the benefit of their hard work or increased productivity. Cooperative workers, on the other hand, whether they work for a wage or a cut of the profits, do, however, benefit from their increased efficiency and productivity due to their co-ownership and stake within the enterprise. Now, being aware of these issues, is there any way around this? Well, luckily for us, Luxembourg & Co. have written about this. One road to success for the cooperative working within a capitalist framework is to maintain for itself a constant stream of consumers. In doing so, it removes itself from the laws of the market, those being the laws of competition, and can remain afloat. This makes problems of its own, however. For example, how can such cooperatives be established where conventional capitalist enterprises already reign supreme? For example, opening up a cooperative grocery store next to a Walmart would be incredibly stupid because Walmart is A, already well established in the region, and B, provides goods usually at a cheaper price. Not a recipe for a successful co-op. Even if a cooperative manages to establish itself somewhere remote with no competition, it would have to limit itself to its region and not grow outside of it, as it would come into the same problems with the Walmart example. It would also need to form some sort of consumer cooperative that solely consumes from these producing cooperatives. This is one of the only ways they would be able to ensure a steady stream of guaranteed consumers for themselves. And, of course, nothing is stopping any conventional capitalist enterprise from coming in and competing with, or maybe even out-competing, the co-op, as such conventional capitalist enterprises employ the exploitation of their workers to the fullest, and hence manage to provide goods at a cheaper price, as previously mentioned. These hypothetical cooperatives would also have to limit themselves to, most likely, the immediate needs of the local population, such as food production. Cooperative enterprises limited to agriculture and not expanding into metalwork and mining and heavy industry, etc., isn't a very promising road for radical change. That's not to say that there aren't existing large cooperatives in those fields, but reorganization of current enterprises, for example through worker-led buyouts due to enterprise bankruptcy, versus starting ones in those fields from scratch are two separate conversations. Luxembourg points out that one of the only ways in which such cooperatives would be sustained would be through the breaking up of the world economy into smaller local spheres of production and exchange. Modern-day late-stage capitalism would have to revert to more primitive forms of economic organization, and the attractiveness of such an option is limited. This definitely is valid criticism from Luxembourg, but a weaker point overall when it relates to co-ops, in my opinion. This misses something else, though. That is the mentality and class interests reflected by a cooperative. This is analysis that goes beyond the depth intended by this video, but cooperatives have 2 points of contention within the working class movement. One is that it would represent only the general interest of a subsection of the working class, so the veracity of cooperatives being a political movement of the entire class, if developed, is taken into question. Furthermore, cooperative movements within imperial core countries can reflect the interests of the wider class image within said countries, which could have labor aristocratic interests that in some cases oppose progressive movements in the imperial periphery. This also leads into a replication of petty bourgeois mentality within cooperatives, as a cooperative is more the private property of a small group as opposed to the public property of all of society. This reminds me of Che Guevara's interesting comments on a particular Soviet manual of economics outlined by Helen Yaffe. The context is cooperative farms in the USSR. To quote, Che concluded that the manual is not able to deny that the cooperatives generate capitalism. Although it has collective tendencies, it is a collective in contradiction to the big collective. If this is not a step towards more advanced forms, a capitalist superstructure will develop and come into contradiction with society. The big collective is the nation, and more advanced forms refers to social ownership of the means of production, which eliminates commodity exchange relations between units of production because there is no transferal of ownership, thus the law of value is undermined. This is a deeper theoretical point of worker-led state ownership, meaning no exchange or transfer of ownership, occurring between enterprises, they all have the same owner, fundamentally undermining a core aspect of capitalist exchange. TLDR, cooperatives are a step forward for capitalism, but generally a step backward under socialism if a progressive policy toward them is not undertaken. This also somewhat leads into the confusion of some as to the difference between state property and cooperative property within socialist countries, and the false assumption that worker participation in planning and enterprise management is only a feature of cooperatives, despite this being both historically as well as theoretically wrong. This is all beyond the scope and intended message of this video, though. So, having said all of this, what are the positives of cooperative enterprises? Well, there are quite a few. Firstly, a democratic and cooperative way of running an enterprise could help alleviate feelings of alienation in the workplace. This is even supported by research, as cooperative workers are generally happier than their counterparts working in conventional capitalist enterprises. Secondly, and most importantly in my opinion, workers working and running a cooperative proves to the workers themselves that they do have both the knowledge and tools necessary to run the local, and by extension worldwide economy. A common argument against socialism in general is that the capitalists are needed in order for the enterprise to function normally, but this is just bullshit, as cooperative enterprises, and everything else, have already proven. Those working and directly influencing the course of production understand magnitudes more than a detached board of directors hundreds if not thousands of miles away. So what does that leave us with? Well, this isn't to say we shouldn't be fighting for the build-up of a cooperative economy within capitalist nations, just that it would be an uphill battle. Not only this, but our priorities have to be in order. Some, like Richard Wolff, do take a quote-unquote long-game approach to cooperatives, as can be surmised from my discussion with him several months ago. The general gist of that idea would be to build up cooperatives, which at a sufficient level of growth will allow us to develop increased political capital and a drive to push for cooperative, worker interests, which leads to slowly joining the political system through policies and even parties directly calling for further cooperative buildup. Eventually, the material conditions and the consequences of such actions would heighten the class struggle to a possible point of revolution or other meaningful form of change. I personally don't fully agree with the strategy, but that doesn't mean it isn't valid. Just that it's too slow and precarious for it to be a solitary strategy, especially in light of the ongoing climate catastrophe. Maybe as part of a much wider labor movement, but otherwise feels like an eggs-in-one-basket sort of situation, mixed with the usual fallacies of reformism. All in all, cooperatives won't bring about socialism on their own, and they can only be maintained, certainly, through the overarching aim of dismantling capitalism and establishing the dictatorship of the proletariat. In simpler terms, cooperatives can only be viable when coupled with a political strategy focused on not only creating an economic alternative to capitalism, but also aiming for the complete dismantling of it and the concrete construction of socialism. This is my opinion and the conclusion of this video. And that's all for this time. Don't forget to take a look at the podcast, you won't regret it. The links, like I mentioned, in the description and the pinned comment. If you enjoy what I do, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. It really does help. I'd like to thank my patrons, so thank you to Ladam O. Camillus? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Brosnan, Kyle Wild, Scottish Proletarian, Mike Nolan, Norwig Ladd, Comrade Pants, Anthony Crensel, Robert Wang, Blender Freaky Null, Old Left, Dylan Moore, Andrea Maya, Rokuzoro, Greg S., Profit Rate, Random Gooey 220, Big D, Steven, Kurt, Varro, Some Weeb, Stripe Yeen, Overlord, Woodtrim in PKL, Marxism, Lesbianism, Yaoism, Faraz Mohseni, Alex P., Aisha Ali, Pao Benazet Montobio, and Daryl. Thanks for watching.